You're deep in the Wyoming wilderness, 1934. The sound of dynamite echoes through the mountains as two gold prospectors blast their way into what they hope will be their fortune. But when the smoke clears and the dust settles, they've uncovered something far more valuable than gold. And infinitely more terrifying. Sitting on a stone ledge perfectly preserved for centuries is a tiny figure that shouldn't exist. Its eyes seem to stare directly at them, its adult-like face twisted in what looks like eternal anguish. This is Pedro, and his story will haunt you. The year was somewhere between 1932 and 1934, when fortune hunters Cecil and Frank Carr made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the scientific community. Deep in Carbon County, Wyoming's San Pedro Mountains, near the aptly named Little Man mining claim, they blasted open a cave that had been sealed by nature itself for who knows how long. What they found inside defied explanation. Seated on a rocky ledge, as if placed there by careful, reverent hands, was a mummified figure unlike anything they'd ever seen. At just 7 inches tall while seated, barely 17 inches if standing, this wasn't just small. It was impossibly, unnaturally small. But here's what made their blood run cold. This wasn't a child, not exactly. The face staring back at them belonged to what appeared to be a fully grown adult, complete with a mouth full of sharp, almost predatory teeth. The skull was grotesquely flattened, the skin darkened and leathery from centuries of mountain air. At just 1 pound, this tiny being seemed to bridge the gap between nightmare and reality. But here's where the story gets truly chilling. The indigenous peoples of Wyoming and Montana had been telling stories about beings exactly like this for generations. They called them the Neanthredal, a race of tiny, vicious warriors who lived in the mountains and showed no mercy to their enemies. These weren't friendly fairy tale creatures. According to legend, the Neanthredal were brutal, using poison-tipped arrows and practicing a horrifying ritual. When their people became sick or old, they would crush their skulls with rocks to spare them from weakness. When observers examined Pedro more closely, they noticed something that made their skin crawl. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma. Had they discovered one of the legendary Neanthredal? Was this proof that the little people weren't just campfire stories, but real beings who once stalked these very mountains? Pedro's journey from archaeological specimen to sideshow attraction reads like something out of a horror novel. By 1936, a man named Homer Sherrill claimed to have taken Pedro to Chicago's Field Museum, except there's no record of Pedro ever being there. It's as if the mummy existed in a shadow world, appearing and disappearing at will. Throughout the 1940s, Pedro became Wyoming's most macabre tourist attraction. Displayed in a drugstore in Mills, Wyoming, like some twisted snow globe, the mummy drew crowds of the curious and the horrified. Eventually, a Casper car dealer named Ivan Goodman purchased Pedro, placing the tiny figure in a glass dome where it sat on his desk like a paperweight from hell. Goodman was convinced he owned the preserved remains of a 65-year-old man from an unknown race. Visitors would come from hundreds of miles away just to stare at Pedro's haunting face, each person leaving with their own theory about what they'd witnessed. Then, in 1950, Pedro simply disappeared. Some say Goodman lost the mummy during a business trip to New York. Others claim he sold it to Leonard Wadler, a businessman and amateur anthropologist. When Wadler died in the 1980s, Pedro's trail went cold forever. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world of documentation and digital records, a piece of potential scientific history simply vanished without a trace. No photographs of the sale, no shipping records, no insurance claims, nothing. It's as if Pedro walked out of our world the same way he'd walked into it, mysteriously and without explanation. By the late 1940s, scientists finally got their hands on X-rays and photographs of Pedro. Anthropologists Harry Shapiro and Paul Martin studied the evidence and reached a conclusion that was both relieving and somehow disappointing. Pedro was most likely an infant born with anencephaly, a rare birth defect where the brain and skull fail to form properly. This condition, occurring in about 3 out of every 10,000 births, is always fatal. Infants with anencephaly rarely survive more than a few hours or days. The flattened skull, the adult-like facial features, even the developed appearance, all could be explained by this tragic medical condition combined with natural mummification in Wyoming's dry mountain air. George Gill, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Wyoming, examined the X-rays and agreed. Pedro wasn't a warrior from a lost race. He was a baby who died shortly after birth, his tiny body preserved by chance in a mountain cave. Just when it seemed like science had solved the mystery, the story took another bizarre turn. In 1994, after an episode of Unsolved Mysteries featured Pedro's tale, a Cheyenne family came forward with their own shocking secret. They owned another tiny mummy. They called her Chiquita, and she was even smaller than Pedro, just 4 inches tall. Like Pedro, she'd been naturally mummified and found in Wyoming. The family had purchased her from a sheep herder in the late 1920s and kept her as a private curiosity for decades. Unlike Pedro, Chiquita could be subjected to modern scientific analysis. Researchers performed DNA tests, carbon dating, and detailed X-rays. The results? She was a Native American female infant, also born with anencephaly, who had died sometime between 1500 and 1700 AD. But here's what kept scientists awake at night. Chiquita's burial position was identical to Pedro's. Arms wrapped around knees, seated upright. This wasn't a typical Native American burial practice. Even stranger, Chiquita had light-colored, almost blonde hair, extremely rare among indigenous populations. Before scientists could fully study these anomalies, Chiquita's family withdrew her from research. Like Pedro before her, she disappeared back into private hands, taking her secrets with her. Even with scientific explanations, the mystery refuses to die. Why were both mummies found in such unusual burial positions? Why has no one ever discovered similar remains anywhere else in North America? Could there be a lost cultural practice that explains these singular discoveries? And most haunting of all, where is Pedro now? In 2005, New York creationist John Adolphi offered $10,000 for information leading to Pedro's recovery. The reward remains unclaimed. Pedro could be sitting in someone's attic right now, or he might have been thrown away decades ago, his secrets lost forever. So what's the real story? The scientific evidence strongly suggests that both Pedro and Chiquita were tragic victims of a birth defect that, in ancient times, must have seemed supernatural to those who witnessed it. Imagine being a Native American parent 500 years ago, giving birth to a child with such unusual features. In a world where medical knowledge was limited, wouldn't such a birth seem connected to the spirit world? Perhaps the legends of the Neanthredal weren't about a race of tiny warriors at all. Maybe they were cultural memories of children born with conditions like anencephaly, children so unusual in appearance that they became woven into the fabric of mythology. The blunt force trauma observed on Pedro's skull might not have been evidence of ritual killing, but simply damage that occurred during the mummification process or discovery. Yet even as science provides answers, questions linger in the shadows. These weren't typical infant burials. The careful positioning, the remote cave locations, the perfect preservation, all suggest these children were treated with special reverence, perhaps even feared. Were Pedro and Chiquita simply medical anomalies, or were they something more? Evidence of how ancient peoples dealt with births that seem to bridge the natural and supernatural worlds? The missing mummies can't tell us, but their absence speaks volumes about how some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. What do you think happened to Pedro? Was he a medical curiosity that captured imaginations? Or could there be more to the story than science admits? Have the legends of the Neanthredal been too quickly dismissed? Or do they represent ancient attempts to explain the unexplainable? The next time you're driving through Wyoming's mountains, remember Pedro's story. Somewhere in those peaks, there might be more caves, more secrets, more tiny figures waiting to challenge everything we think we know about the past. Because sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries aren't the ones we can't solve, they're the ones that disappear just when we're getting close to the truth. What are your thoughts? Do you believe Pedro was simply a tragic medical case? Or could these tiny mummies represent something we've yet to understand? Share your theories below, and remember, in a world full of documented everything, some secrets still managed to slip away into the darkness.